Most films are a troubled production, whether they be schedules overrunning, budgets being stretched thin, egos clashing on set. That's just kind of the nature of the beast that is Hollywood. But every so often a film comes along whose behind the scenes story is so chaotic, so genuinely dangerous and so completely out of control that it stops being a troubled production and starts being something a little closer to a disaster movie in its own right. Apocalypse Now is such a film. Francis Ford Coppola went into the Philippine jungle in 1976 to try and make a film about the madness of war, and the jungle gave him exactly what he was looking for, just not in the way he probably anticipated. What followed was one of the most extraordinary, punishing and frankly unbelievable production stories in cinema history. This is what really happened on the set of Apocalypse Now. Pop pop! So we'll begin with the script, and it was a script that nobody could crack. The story of Apocalypse Now's chaos begins long before anybody even set foot within the Philippines. The film was based on Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, transposed to the Vietnam War, and the script had been floating around Hollywood for years. John Milius wrote the original screenplay. George Lucas was attached to direct it at one point, planning to shoot it as a low-budget guerrilla-style film during the actual Vietnam War. That version would never end up happening, and by the time that Coppola took over the project, the script was already a decade in the making and the film had no ending that anyone was fully satisfied with. Coppola went into the production without a completed script and without knowing fully how his film was going to conclude, and that single decision would set the tone for everything else that would follow. Because next up we have the cast, which was that Harvey Keitel was actually originally cast and then got fired within a few weeks. The original Captain Willard, who was the film's main protagonist, who's the soldier who sent deep into the jungle to assassinate the rogue Colonel Kurtz, was not actually originally Martin Sheen. It was Harvey Keitel. Keitel actually would fly out to the Philippines, begin shooting, and then be replaced almost immediately. Coppola felt that his interpretation of the character wasn't working and made a decision to recast before the production had barely begun. Martin Sheen was then brought in as the replacement, and while the decision ultimately produced one of the greatest performances of the era, it cost the production enormously in time, money and momentum, at a stage when it couldn't really afford to lose any of those things. We've mentioned a few times that this film was set within the Philippines, and that's where they decided to film, and that was an inspired but catastrophic choice. It was Coppola's decision to film in the Philippines because the landscape matched Vietnam and because President Ferdinand Marcos agreed to loan the production actual military helicopters and equipment. It seemed like quite a practical solution to an enormous logistical issue. It turned out to be one of the most consequential decisions of the entire shoot. For a start, the Philippine military had a habit of pulling the helicopters mid-production whenever a real military operation required them, which would leave Coppola stranded without the equipment that some of the biggest set pieces of the film were required for. But the deeper problem was the environment itself. The jungle was brutal, remote and relentless. Crew members got sick, the heat was punishing, supply chains were heavily complicated by the sheer distance they were from anywhere, and the production had essentially dropped a small city into one of the most inhospitable filming environments imaginable. Don't worry, it gets worse though, because an actual typhoon destroyed the sets. Just when you think this story cannot get more extreme, it gets more extreme. Somebody invited the Hardy Boys. In 1976, Typhoon Olga tore through the Philippines and destroyed a significant portion of the film set entirely. Weeks of construction and preparation were wiped out within a matter of hours, and the production shut down for several weeks whilst the damage was assessed and rebuilding took place. The budget, which was already climbing steadily beyond its original estimates, took another enormous hit. Coppola, who was personally financing a significant portion of the film and had put his own money and reputation on the line, was staring at a project that was threatening to consume everything that he had. The shutdown gave him time to rewrite and reconsider, but it also extended an already painfully long shoot even further into the unknown. And that brings us to another issue on set, which was the Marlon Brando issue. Colonel Kurtz was the role at the centre of the entire film, the mythic, terrifying figure at the end of Willard's journey. Coppola had cast Brando, one of the greatest actors alive, for the role. The problem was that Brando arrived in the Philippines having not read Heart of Darkness, not really prepared for the role in any meaningful way, and having gained a significant amount of weight that made the original vision of the character unworkable. The contract stipulated that Kurt should appear as a physically imposing soldier. What Coppola got was something very different indeed. Rather than send Brando home and face the consequences of losing his lead actor, Coppola made a creative decision that was born entirely out of necessity. He would keep Kurt in the shadow, filming from angles that obscured his size, and leading to an interpretation of the character as something almost supernatural rather than physically dominant. The famous scenes of Brando half-lit in darkness were not a stylistic masterstroke of Coppola that were planned from the very beginning. They were a solution to a problem that walked off a plane unannounced. And the fact that they are now considered some of the most iconic images in cinema history tells you almost everything you need to know about how chaos can accidentally produce genius. But that wasn't the only issue that Brando had, as his weight was not the only problem he caused. He also refused to learn his lines, and instead just wanted to improvise large portions of his performance. He and Coppola would spend days in conversation, having recorded conversations that Coppola would use to help shape what Brando would eventually say on camera. The Kurt's monologues that made it into the final film are a patchwork of improvisation, recorded discussion, and fragments of scripted material, all stitched together in a way that somehow produces something genuinely haunting. Coppola later said that working with Brando was one of the most creatively exhausting periods of his career. The scenes work, however, but the process of getting them was, by most accounts, an incredible ordeal. And then you've got his other lead, Martin Sheen, who happened to have a heart attack on set. And this is the moment where the production crossed from extraordinary into genuinely frightening. Martin Sheen, who had been carrying the film on his shoulders since replacing Keitel, and for me is the best part of the film, suffered a heart attack on the set at the age of just 36. The production was in the middle of the jungle. Sheen had to crawl to the road himself before help could reach him. He survived, but the incident forced another extended shutdown and raised serious questions about whether the film could continue at all. Sheen later said that he was in a deeply troubled personal place during the shoot, struggling with alcohol and the accumulated physical and psychological toll of a production that had pushed everybody involved far beyond their normal limits. His performance in the film, though, particularly the extraordinary opening scene in the hotel room, draws a rawness that is very difficult to manufacture, and some of that rawness is very real. We've mentioned his name a few times though, and that was that through all of this, Francis Ford Coppola, the man who had just come off The Godfather and The Godfather 2 back to back, the most celebrated director on the planet, was unravelling. He was personally in debt for millions of dollars. He was working without a finished script on a film that was ballooning out of control. He was watching his cast disintegrate around him and his sets get destroyed by the weather. He reportedly threatened to take his own life on more than one occasion during the production, though those around him debate the seriousness of those moments. He told journalists at Cannes when the film was eventually shown that he had too much money, too much equipment, and gradually went insane, drawing a direct parallel between his own experience making the film and the themes of the film itself. That parallel isn't a marketing angle though, it's just a real description of what happened. And then we've got the fact that the production ran for over a year and a half. The original shoot was scheduled for 17 weeks, and it would last approximately 16 months, which is, if you work on the basis that every month has 4 weeks in, is so like 64 weeks roughly, which is like a lot more than 17. So by the time that principal photography finally wrapped up, the film was years behind its original release date, tens of millions of dollars over budget, and it generated enough behind the scenes footage to fill a documentary of its own, which is exactly what ended up happening when Coppola's wife Eleanor released Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse in 1991. One of the greatest making of documentaries has ever made, and a film that is almost as devastating as the one it actually chronicles. However, here's what's remarkable about all of this stuff we've just discussed. Every single one of those disasters left a mark on the finished production, and almost all of those marks made the production better. Brando's physical condition produced the shadow photography, his refusal to use a script produced the improvised monologues, Sheen's real psychological deterioration produced the hotel room scene, Coppola's own breakdown produced a film that understands the madness it is depicting, not just intellectually but from the inside. The famous line, the horror, lands the way it does partly because the people making the film had genuinely experienced something in that jungle that they could not fully explain or articulate. The chaos didn't undermine Apocalypse Now. In a very real sense, it's the reason Apocalypse Now is what it is. Apocalypse Now was released back in 1979, after years of suffering, and is now widely considered one of the greatest films ever made. It won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes, it was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, and it sits on virtually every serious list of the most important films in cinema history, and none of that would have happened the way it happened without the typhoon, without Brando's unpreparedness, without Sheen's collapse, without Coppola betting everything he had on a film he wasn't sure he could finish. And there's something almost poetic about that. Coppola went into the jungle to make a film about what happens when human beings are pushed past the edge of reason by impossible circumstances, and the jungle would end up pushing him past the edge of reason by impossible circumstances. He would come out on the other side with a masterpiece. Most directors have war stories about difficult productions. Francis Ford Coppola made his war story into the film. And that is either the most insane thing that's ever happened in Hollywood, or the most brilliant, and knowing what we know now, I think it might actually be both. But that is all for now. So, have you seen Apocalypse Now, and did you enjoy it? Be sure to let me know in the comment section down below. If you've enjoyed this video, then be sure to give it a thumbs up and click the subscribe button if you are new around here. That is all for now, so I'd like to thank you for watching, and we'll see you later. Pop pop!